Engagement, Beyond the EdTech Flashing Lights, a presentation by Paul Hamilton. So why am I giving this presentation? I guess as an education technologist, my primary role is to teach teachers and to teach students, I guess, to use technology effectively in schools. And so I'm really passionate about this because I think there's a real misconception that students that are quiet, students that are engaged with screens are actually engaged in learning, and that's not the case at all. And that's why I'm giving this presentation. So here's the big one. What are our students actually engaged in? They're engaged in what? What holds their attention? When they're looking at screens, when they're looking at iPads, desktop, laptop screens, are they actually engaged in learning? And the answer to that is no. They're not engaged in it. They may be engaged in the learning process, but they may also be engaged just with what's happening on the screen, whether it be flashing lights, a moving graphic. Any one of those they could be engaged in. But let's not say that that is necessarily a good thing in regard to education. And that's what this presentation is all about, getting us to reflect on how we're using technology in schools. So that was my point. Let's not assume that students, and let's say they're in a one-to-one school and all our students have a laptop or a desktop or access to a desktop or even an iPad. Let's not assume that they're learning if they're quiet. This is a really, really important thing to realize as teachers, that yes, they may be engaged with what's happening on the screens, but let's not assume that they're actually learning anything at all. I know if I take my daughters as a primary example, that they can look at an iPad or a laptop for hours on end looking at funny dog photos, for example, but they're not engaged in learning. They're engaged with the pictures and the content, and they may be engaged in the little quotes that come with it. But from an educational point of view, they're actually not engaged in the process of learning. I get this question asked of me as quite a lot as a teacher in the school that I'm currently at, and mainly by parents. Paul, can you recommend an app that will teach my son or my daughter to read? The answer is no, I can't, because there's not an app that can do that. Often you'll see babies and little kids watching a Dr. Seuss interactive app that when they tilt it, it moves left and it moves right, but it's not actually teaching the child to read. Teaching a child to read is a much more complex task than actually looking at a screen. And I think there's certainly apps and there's certainly web-based applications that can help in the process. But will that actually teach them? No, it won't. And if we look at kids carefully and look at what they're looking at on the screen, they're actually engaged more with what the graphic is doing, what the app is doing, more than the actual process of reading. And I think that's a really important thing to actually remember, both as teachers as parents. I know I'm a big advocate on technology in schools, but over time, I guess, and as I've become more experienced, I've started to question what our students are actually engaged in. The interactive whiteboard is a perfect example of this, and I know teachers are using them to really good effect in schools, but if we look often at what our students are engaged in, they're engaged with the technology itself. They're not actually engaged in the learning part of the aspect. They're engaged with moving one thing over to a side of another. They're not engaged in the message or the rich task that we want our kids engaged in. Often when a kid is up at the front with an interactive whiteboard, well, what are the other kids doing? What are they engaged with? Are they engaged in the student moving something or pressing on a button? Are they immersed and engaged in the sounds or the graphics that's moving across the screen? Or are they actually engaged with the learning aspect of the class? And I think as teachers, we need to really ask ourselves those big questions. Maybe it would be better for our students to actually be doing the task, to creating, to building knowledge themselves instead of sitting back and watching as a whole. It's certainly a question that I've asked a lot in the last 6 to 12 months. So that's all well and good, Paul, but how do we actually engage our students in the learning process through the use of technology? I've been, I guess, a little bit negative throughout and actually questioning teachers and parents and educators about what they're doing in classrooms. But what can we actually do? What are the tasks How can we use technology to bring about greater learning in the process of learning? And so I've got here a few examples. Okay, so the number one, let's get children actually creating digital stories, authoring and publishing using technology. Let's get each student doing that, from the full process of writing a story, from the planning and the storyboarding right through to the editing. Where is the adult feedback? Where's the feedback kids are getting in the process of using technology to create stories that improves their story writing ability? We want students actually creating movies, creating music, creating art digitally, and that's great. But once again, as they're using the technology, where are the milestones? Where are the points in which they're getting feedback to improve it? If they've created something from start to finish without any feedback at all, I really question the process of using technology in that regard. And that's where we can use things like Google Apps, for example, to get feedback from other teachers and from other students on that. Let's engross and engage our students in tasks like coding. Teaching our kids to code is more than actually being engaged with what's on the screen. It's actually about writing code, testing it, reflecting on it. Talking about reflection, student reflective digital journals. Getting kids to actually take snapshots, for example, using mobile technology, of tests and learning tasks in class, and actually digitally getting them to reflect on what they did well, what they need to do better next time and moving forward. And the other way that we can use technology incredibly effective in classrooms is the planning and organisation of their thoughts, the mind mapping. Digitally doing this really gets kids to think about where they are and where they need to get to in their journey. Here are just a couple of really easy but effective ways that we can use technology in classrooms that really focus on the learning aspect and less on the technology itself. Schools, have a really clear picture on how you want to use technology in your schools. This is the one that I'm currently, a vision statement where I'm working currently at Matthew Flinders Primary School, where we've really sat down with all the teachers and had buy-in from all the teachers, reflecting on where do we want ICTs and technology integrated into our curriculum, and what do we want it to do? And I think this is a really important question that all schools should be asking themselves before they buy any technology and before they incorporate any sort of technology into classroom teaching and learning pedagogy. So if you want to know more, there's just a couple of websites and different places you can find me. The Apps by Paul Hamilton on YouTube, lots of tutorials about what I've been talking about here today, especially with these sort of tasks. I've got a lot of tutorials about how we can actually use those in classrooms and in schools throughout the world, and how we can actually focus more on the process of learning than the actual technology itself. So Paul Hamilton here, signing off. I hope you got something out of today's lesson. Which was all about, obviously, engagement with our kids and looking beyond the flashing lights and looking beyond the technology and focusing more about engagement in learning and student engagement in the process of learning. Paul Hamilton here, signing off.